Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something pretty fascinating today. We're going back to 1978.
Ooh, 1978.
Yeah, a pivotal year, really, for U.S.-Africa relations. And we've got this really cool article to guide us.
Really?
It's called U.S. Foreign Policy in a Changing Africa by Henry Bienen. And it gives us this great snapshot of how U.S. interests in Africa were evolving back then. What were they thinking? What were they worried about? What were their goals? The crazy thing is how much it helps us understand U.S.-Africa relations even today, almost 50 years later.
Right. I mean, so much has changed, but some things haven't.
Exactly. So buckle up, folks. We're going to uncover some really interesting stuff. And get this, the whole focus on Southern Africa, with apartheid and everything,
Right.
it might have been making the U.S. miss some other really important developments in other parts of Africa.
That's so interesting. I mean, this piece really captures this moment when the old rules of the game in Africa were starting to crumble.
Okay, so tell me more about that. What were these old rules?
Well, after a lot of African nations gained independence, there was this idea that they would interact with each other based on certain norms, right?
Like what? Give me some examples.
Okay, so territorial integrity was huge, respecting each other's borders, and then there was non-interference.
Okay, so like not meddling in each other's internal affairs.
Yeah. And peaceful resolution of disputes was another biggie.
So basically everyone playing nice and being good neighbors.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Bienen argues that these norms were already being challenged, even way back in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, really? So like what were some of the warning signs back then?
Well, there was Somalia always getting into border disputes with its neighbors.
Right, right.
And then you had those secessionist movements like Katanga trying to break away from Congo.
Oh, yeah, and Biafra, right, trying to separate from Nigeria.
Exactly. Those are like cracks in the foundation of this, this whole post-colonial order. It showed that things weren't as stable as they seemed.
I see, I see. So these were like early indicators that trouble was brewing.
Yeah, you could say that. And on top of all this, Bienen points to this growing differentiation between African nations. It means they were becoming more and more diverse. Economically, some were taking off, others were struggling. Militarily, some were building up their armies, others were falling behind. And politically, you had this whole spectrum from multi-party democracies to authoritarian regimes.
Ah, so it was getting way more complicated than just like big countries versus small countries?
Exactly. It was like this whole new game board was emerging with all these different players and different strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so speaking of different players, Nigeria, they were really starting to make a name for themselves at this time, right?
Oh, absolutely. Bienen really highlights how Nigeria was on its way to becoming a major continental power. Big population, tons of oil wealth, and a growing voice in organizations like the Organization of African Unity.
So they were kind of like the up-and-comer everyone was watching.
Definitely. And they were building up their military, too, one of the largest armies in sub-Saharan Africa, in fact.
Well, okay. So what did all this mean for the U.S.? How did they view Nigeria's rise?
Well, that's a question Bienen digs into. It seems like the U.S. was still trying to figure out how to deal with this new, more assertive Nigeria.
I bet. It wasn't just about containing the Soviets anymore. They had to think about Nigeria's own goals and ambitions.
Exactly. And it's fascinating because Bienen draws a parallel between Nigeria and South Africa.
South Africa, wait a minute, they were still under apartheid back then, a totally different system.
True. Bienen recognized that despite their differences, both countries were like regional powerhouses. Nigeria in West Africa, South Africa in the South.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection.
And that made their internal stability, or lack thereof, a big concern for the U.S.
Right, because if they were unstable, it could have ripple effects across the whole region.
Exactly. And get this, even these giants, as Bienen calls them, weren't immune to internal problems.
What kind of issues were they facing?
Well, Nigeria was dealing with serious ethnic and religious tensions. There was a real fear that things could boil over.
Oh, I bet. And South Africa, of course, had the whole apartheid situation, which was obviously a powder keg.
Yeah, a lot of internal pressure building up in both countries. And Bienen's point is that the U.S. might have been overestimating their stability.
So focusing on these big players might have actually blinded them to some of the underlying weaknesses.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key player in all of this, one that was really starting to make waves in Africa: the Soviet Union.
Ah, yes, the Cold War.
Yeah.
Can't escape that, can we?
Bienen highlights how the Soviets, often with their ally Cuba, were becoming more and more active in Africa. They were providing military aid, backing liberation movements, even directly intervening in conflicts like in Angola.
I can imagine that put the U.S. on high alert.
It did. But the question is, how did they respond to this growing Soviet influence?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about how Africa was becoming this more and more complex place in the 70s.
Right, right.
New powers emerging, Cold War tensions, all that.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what was the U.S. really after in Africa? What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, Bienen lays out a few of the common arguments about U.S. interests in Africa.
Okay, hit me.
Access to raw materials, that was a big one.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Africa's got a ton of natural resources.
Especially minerals from southern Africa, that was a major concern.
Okay, I can see that.
But here's where it gets interesting. Bienen points out that at the time, U.S. trade with Black Africa was actually bigger than trade with South Africa.
Huh. Really? I would have thought South Africa was like the economic center.
It was a big player for sure, but it wasn't the whole story. The U.S. was already doing a lot of business with other African countries.
So it's more complicated than just saying they just wanted South African minerals.
Exactly. It shows that the U.S. was already engaged economically with a wider range of African nations.
Okay, so raw materials were one thing, but what about the strategic side of things? I mean, this was the Cold War after all.
The U.S. was worried about securing those strategic sea lanes around Africa, for shipping and stuff.
Right, and they probably wanted to keep an eye on the Soviets too.
Absolutely. They were also thinking about the possibility of setting up military bases in Africa, just in case.
So a mix of economic and security interests.
Yeah, pretty much. But Bienen also brings up a moral dimension to U.S. policy.
Oh, right. He talked about apartheid, didn't he?
He did. He acknowledged that the U.S. had a moral obligation to oppose apartheid in South Africa, but he also argued that this moral concern often took a back seat to those more practical considerations, like maintaining access to South African resources.
So it was this balancing act between what was morally right and what was strategically beneficial.
Exactly. Tough choices.
It sounds like U.S. policymakers had a lot on their plate back then. But did they even have a clear strategy? Or was it more just reacting to events as they unfolded?
Bienen argues that there was this tendency to be reactive, especially when it came to the Soviet Union.
Always trying to one-up the Soviets, huh?
Kind of, and he says this reactive approach sometimes led to some pretty big missteps.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, Angola is a perfect case study. The U.S. got really involved in the Angolan Civil War because they saw it as a proxy fight with the Soviets.
Right, the Soviets were backing the MPLA.
Exactly. And the U.S. ended up supporting the other side, but ultimately they couldn't stop the MPLA from coming to power.
So they basically got dragged into this conflict without fully understanding what was going on.
That's Bienen's argument. He says the U.S. was so focused on countering the Soviets that they missed the nuances of the situation, the internal dynamics of the conflict.
So it's like they were so obsessed with the big picture, they lost sight of the details on the ground.
Yeah, and that kind of strategic myopia, that short-sightedness could really backfire.
Got it. But let's go back to South Africa for a minute.
Okay.
If the U.S. was so worried about stability in the region and about access to resources, wouldn't it make sense for them to just support the white minority government? I mean, from a purely strategic point of view.
And it was the thinking at the time, for sure.
Right, like, better the devil you know.
But Bienen challenges that assumption. He points out that even those regimes that seemed friendly to the U.S., even the ones providing valuable resources, they were always going to act in their own best interests, which might not align with U.S. interests in the long run.
So he's saying putting all your eggs in the South Africa basket was a risky bet.
Exactly. Relying on a regime that was fundamentally unstable and increasingly isolated wasn't a sustainable strategy.
Okay, but what about that fear that a black majority government in South Africa would be hostile to U.S. interests? That was a big concern back then, right?
It was a common argument. But Bienen pushes back against it. He says the U.S. should be engaging with all African nations, regardless of their internal politics, and supporting those peaceful transitions to more inclusive government.
Yeah, so he's saying, don't be scared of change, embrace it.
That's a good way to put it. He believed the U.S. needed to be more forward-thinking, anticipate the changes coming to Africa and position themselves as a partner to all African nations, not just the ones aligned with the West.
He was ahead of his time.
Yeah, for sure.
So it sounds like Bien was calling for a much more nuanced and flexible approach to U.S. foreign policy in Africa.
That's exactly right. He wanted policymakers to see Africa not just as this battleground for superpower rivalry, but as a continent full of diverse nations, each with their own aspirations.
Not just pawns in the Cold War game.
Right. And that's what makes his analysis so relevant, even today.
It's crazy how an article from almost 50 years ago can still feel so timely.
I know, right? But the questions he raises, the challenges he outlines, they're still with us.
Okay, so if this was the state of play in 1978, I'm really curious. How has the U.S.-Africa relationship evolved since then? What's changed? What's stayed the same? That's a question we'll be tackling in the last part of our deep dive. It's amazing to think that Bienen wrote this back in '78. It was like he was looking into the future or something.
I know, right? It's like he was giving us a roadmap.
So let's fast forward to today. What's different? What's changed in the U.S.-Africa relationship since Bienen's time?
Well, the biggest game changer was obviously the end of the Cold War.
Right, the Soviet Union's gone.
That completely reshaped how the U.S. viewed Africa.
It's like they didn't have to see everything through that us versus them lens anymore.
Exactly. It created a lot of new possibilities, but also some challenges. Well, on the one hand, it opened the door for a more, constructive relationship with Africa, less about ideology, more about partnership.
Right, makes sense.
But at the same time, without that Soviet threat, Africa kind of lost its strategic importance in Washington.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like they didn't feel the need to pay as much attention anymore.
Yeah, kind of. But then you have the rise of new economic powers, especially China.
Yeah. China's been making some big moves in Africa.
Huge investments, trade deals, aid packages, the whole 9 yards.
So that's got to be shaking things up for the U.S.
Big time. Now they've got to compete with China for influence and resources.
Like a whole new kind of rivalry. But this time it's about economics, not ideology.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just China. You've got India, Brazil, Turkey, all increasing their engagement with Africa.
So it's a much more crowded playing field these days.
For sure. But we've also got to talk about how Africa itself has changed since the 70s.
Oh, yeah, for sure. What are some of the biggest changes you've observed?
Well, there's been some incredible economic growth in many African countries.
Yeah, I've heard about that, the Africa Rising story and all that.
Right. Some economies are growing really fast, but it's important to remember that this growth hasn't benefited everyone equally.
Right, there's still huge disparities.
Exactly. Some countries are doing really well, but others are lagging behind. And poverty and inequality are still major issues.
So it's a more complicated picture than just Africa's booming.
Much more. It's a story of progress, but also ongoing challenges.
What about politically? Has there been any progress on that front, like with democracy and governance?
There definitely has. We've seen a trend towards democratization across the continent, more multi-party elections, more countries embracing democratic principles.
That's encouraging.
It is. But it's not all smooth sailing. Democracy is fragile, and there have been some setbacks, some countries slipping back into authoritarianism.
Right, it's never a straight line to progress.
And then you have the persistent problems of corruption and weak governance in many places.
Yeah, those are tough issues to tackle.
They are. And it's a reminder that building a strong, democratic, and prosperous future for Africa is a long-term process.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. And it's going to take a lot of effort, not just from African nations themselves, but also from the international community.
So what does all of this mean for the future of the U.S.-Africa relationship? Where do we go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it? But I think Bienen gives us some valuable clues.
Like what?
Well, he reminds us that there are no simple solutions, no one-size-fits-all answers.
Right. Africa's too diverse for that.
Exactly. The U.S. needs to approach its relationship with Africa with a lot more humility, recognizing that African nations have their own agency, their own priorities.
So no more of that we know best attitude from Washington.
Yeah, that's got to go. It's about listening, understanding, and working in partnership as equals.
And what about that tendency to be reactive? Is the U.S. still falling into that trap?
It happens. We still see that knee-jerk reaction to send in the military or slap on sanctions without really understanding the root causes of the problems.
It's like that Cold War mentality is hard to shake, even all these years later.
It is, but there are signs that things are changing. There's a growing realization that a more thoughtful, more proactive approach is needed.
So maybe there's hope for a more balanced and mutually beneficial relationship down the road.
I think so. But it requires a real commitment from the U.S.,
Yeah.
They need to understand the challenges, the opportunities, and engage with Africa on its own terms, recognizing that they're just one player in a very complex game.
It's about building genuine partnerships, not just pursuing their own interests.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
what it comes down to.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into U.S.-Africa relations. We've covered a lot of ground today, but one thing's for sure. This relationship is as complex and fascinating as ever. So as you continue to learn and explore, remember the wisdom of Henry Bienen. Approach Africa with humility, be willing to listen, and always be ready to adapt to the ever-changing landscape of this incredible continent. And that's our show for today, folks. Thanks for listening.